In Autofiles, we trace the famous drivers who emerged in the 1940s, after the Second World War had finally come to an end. European racing was centred on Italy, France, Britain and Switzerland as the sport roared back into action. Italian legend Tazio Nuvolari joined fellow countryman Luigi Villoresi in the semi-works Maseratis to fight the might of Alfa in the first real international event, the 1946 Grand Prix des Nations at Geneva in Switzerland. The two-stage blown 158C Alfa was to make its debut there, and the drivers were Nino Farina, Jean-Pierre Vimille, Achille Varzi and Count Trossi. The British were well represented with Reg Parnell in the ex-Johnny Wakefield 4CL Maserati, while a number of ERAs had made their way to Switzerland, among them the unique R4D driven by Raymond Mays. There was Prince Bira's famous Romulus in its last race in contemporary Grand Prix racing. Peter Whitehead had owned his ERA from new for 10 years, together with Ian Connell, the talented Leslie Brooke and Bob Gerard. This also was the race where George Abecassis returned to the sport with the pre-war Alta, the ex-bomber pilot having recovered from wartime imprisonment and set up a business with John Heath. The company was to become HWM. The Grand Prix des Nations was run over 2 heats and a final, Vermeil winning Heat 1 from Varzi and Villoresi, with Parnell 4th and Bira 5th. Farina won the second heat. Mays finished 5th behind Baron de Graffenried, and Count Trossi duelled with Nuvolari, who'd actually led the race earlier. In the final, Luigi Villoresi suffered brake failure, hitting the wall and breaking his leg. Adding to the excitement, Reg Parnell spun to miss him, and Varzi had problems. Nuvolari had clipped Vimille's Alfa while he was being lapped. Farina was able to claim victory from Trossi, followed by the luckless Frenchman Vermeil. The first Maserati home was Sommer, who finished ahead of Nuvolari with de Graffenried next up. The first British car to finish was Bira in the old ERA known as Romulus. Back in Britain, the Ulster GP attracted Bira and his rebuilt Zoller-blown ERA, now called Hanuman 2. It was a rebuild of the C-Type which he'd crashed at Reims in 1939. There was a fierce duel in this race between the Prince, Bob Gerard and Reg Parnell with the Maserati 4CL. This car had given a lot of trouble in practice, but the battle ended in Bira's favour. It was his first post-war victory and the 21st win of his career. It was significant that Nuvolari drove a tremendous race at the beginning of the 1947 year, finishing second to Biondetti's Alfa Romeo. Tazio was beaten by the weather, not by the opposition. Despite the onset of a long health problem which was to cause his eventual retirement, this was a memorable drive. He took little part in the 1947 season except for a couple of minor events when he drove a sports car built by a new manufacturer, Ferrari. This renewed his association with Enzo Ferrari, the man who had guided his career with Alfa back in the 30s. By 1947, motor racing in Europe was almost on full song. Count Johnny Lurani's Scuderia Ambrosiana was running cars alongside those of Scuderia Milano. Both of these teams were using Maseratis. Ambrosiana allowed Reg Parnell and the Ashmore brothers opportunities which other British drivers didn't have, owing to currency restrictions in force at the time. Maserati adopted two-stage supercharging during 1947, and they produced their first tubular chassis car, which they termed the 4CLT. The body was similar to that of the 4CL. 1947 saw the emergence of Alberto Ascari as a front-runner, and Swiss driver Christian Kautz was also a winner. There was a new mark in racing, Simca Godini. Frenchman Amédée Godini, known as the Sorcerer, had begun to build his first racing cars. Although only 1100cc in capacity, occasionally they joined the ranks of Grand Prix competitors. Raymond Sommer, Prince Bira and Jean-Pierre Vermeil drove these promising newcomers. Bira had acquired a 4CL Maserati for his White Mouse stable's final season. In the Isle of Man race, he retired, allowing Gerard's ERA to win from Whitehead's similar car. Bira then went on to win the Frontier Grand Prix in Belgium, and despite mechanical unreliability, the Siamese prince had clearly lost none of his pre-war skill, particularly if guided by his cousin. However, when they entered races, Alfa Romeo won. Vermeil took 2 victories, Varzi and Trossi taking 1 each, and many placings as well. Consalvo Sanesi, the Italian tester, had the odd race, as did Piero Taruffi for Alfa Romeo. It was curious that Alfa didn't look for younger talent. Reg Parnell had taken a win in Jersey, seeing off all the other 4CL Maseratis, one of which was driven by Frenchman Louis Chiron, who was dividing his time between Maserati and Largo Talbot. During the winter of 1946-47, Vermeil, Varzi and Villoresi had travelled to Argentina. It was a successful visit, and it was repeated a year later. There was some impressive local talent, including an underrated driver, Oscar Galvez, a man unknown outside his own country. Varzi fell in love with Argentina. He was also impressed by another South American driver during this period, Juan Manuel Fangio. Fangio modelled his driving and his attitude on the veteran Italian Achille Varzi. Farina had picked a quarrel with Alfa and raced a privately owned Maserati during 1947, anxiously awaiting Ferrari to join the upper echelon. Enzo Ferrari had competed with some success in the 1920s. He then managed Alfa's affairs with considerable skill in spite of budget considerations, and had fought the Italian cause in Grand Prix racing until 1937. By then, Alfa and their government masters felt that they wanted a hands-on involvement, so Alfa Corsa was created. Enzo Ferrari's time with the Milanese company was drawing to an end. Alfa Romeo's cars for 1938, the 8, 12 and 16-cylinder Grand Prix cars, were not directly Ferrari's responsibility. He had developed the 1.5-litre straight-eight 158 Alfa Romeo, designed by Colombo. Ferrari departed Alfa Romeo midway through 1939 and spent the next 18 months modifying Fiats. Post-war, free of contractual restrictions, he set about taking the battle to Alfa Romeo. Colombo was employed by Ferrari, and together the two constructed the first V12 Ferraris of 1.5 and 2-litre capacity. Nuvolari had found the strength to compete in the Mille Miglia in 1948 with the Ferrari. It was another magnificent drive until the Ferrari virtually fell to pieces around him. A match race was organised soon afterwards between the weakened Tazio and Varzi, which the latter won as Nuvolari was too ill to complete the course. Tragically, in practice at Bern for the Swiss Grand Prix, Achille Varzi was killed, preferring to wear a skull cap rather than a crash helmet, which could have saved his life. During the race, Christian Kautz also crashed to his death. Count Trossi won this race, his last victory before dying of cancer. 1948 also saw the rebodied version of the 4CLT 48 Maserati, which became known as the Sanremo. It featured new front suspension, torsion bars replacing coil springs, and a much lower, neater body. Reg Parnell's son Tim remembers it.
It was rather a brittle car, and I believe the factory only kept it going, really, because they more or less put new engine blocks into it pretty well about every 3 or 4 races. It was we had a dynamometer installed in Derby, at the garage in Derby, and I remember when they put this engine on the dynamometer and you saw it actually running, the way the oil spurted out from everywhere and the water spurted out from everywhere, it really did look horrendous. It was producing probably about around 300 bhp, but from this 4-cylinder engine, and it did look absolutely horrific on the dynamometer.
Prince Igor Trubetskoy, one-time husband of American Woolworth heiress Barbara Hutton, drove a Ferrari sports car in the first Monaco Grand Prix after the war. It was Farina who led Sommer and Bira into battle at Valentino Park in the new Ferrari 125, Enzo's first racing car. This had a 12-cylinder, 1.5-litre engine, originally fitted with a single-stage supercharger, driving through a 5-speed gearbox and in a tubular frame. After experimenting with torsion bars, the Colombo design featured transverse leaf front suspension with wishbones front and rear. It was a difficult car to drive. Bira and Farina retired with transmission problems and an accident respectively, but Sommer finished a close third behind Vermeule's Alfa and Villarese's Maserati. Farina won once for Ferrari in the next race. By the end of the year, Ferrari set about obtaining Alberto Ascari's services and, through him, the experienced Villarese. Villarese remained antagonistic towards Ferrari personally, but he recognized a good car when he saw it and was happy to allow Ascari to organize the business details. They replaced the difficult Dr. Farina, the unpredictable Frenchman Sommer, and the fun-loving Siamese Prince Bira for 1949. By the end of 1948, following the deaths of Varzi and Trossi, Alfa found that Vermeule was more concerned with his embryonic business career than continuing to drive for them. This, together with the threat from Ferrari and the requirement of seeing their new 1900 road car into production, persuaded them to withdraw from racing for a year and prepare for the new World Championship for 1950. However, they kept their eye on the talent available. Before the end of the year, they'd signed Fangio, placated the ferocious Farina, and persuaded the old Abruzzi robber, Luigi Fagioli, to give up his privately owned and obsolete 4CL and join Alfa to form the famous 3Fs team for the first World Championship. Towards the end of 1948, 2 new racing circuits opened in Britain. Following a suggestion by Australian fighter ace Tony Gaze, the Lord March, Duke of Richmond and Gordon, a former winner of the 500-mile race at Brooklands, opened what had been a satellite aerodrome during the Second World War adjacent to Goodwood House and called it the Goodwood Circuit. Reg Parnell's 4CLT won the first major race there against little or no real opposition, but a huge crowd turned out to watch. A month later, the British Racing Drivers Club and the governing body of British motorsport, the Royal Automobile Club, staged the British Grand Prix at Silverstone. Villarese and Ascari made the journey to England to face Bira, Parnell and a host of British cars. Silverstone in those early days wasn't the fast and flowing layout of later years, but ran up and down the runways of the former Bomber airfield 100 kilometres northwest of London. After Bira slowed with problems, Luigi Villarese and Alberto Ascari finished first and second in front of Gerard's old ERA in a race which was to set the scene for the home of British motor racing. At the start of 1949, Jean-Pierre Vermeulen sadly lost his life in a crash in Argentina. The 49 season was in many ways similar to other periods in motor racing, when the death of a champion and other top contenders creates a vacuum. Into that vacuum came Argentinians Juan Manuel Fangio and a little later, José Froilán González. With Alfa Romeo temporarily withdrawing from racing, there were opportunities for other manufacturers to come to the fore and for new drivers to make their names. For 1949, Bira and de Graffenried joined together under the banner of Enrico Plate, a driver turned manager. The fuming Farina returned to a 4CLT 48 Maserati for the year. Ferrari was quite happy that Villaraci should drive his Maserati when the new V12 Ferraris weren't entered. Already they were lengthening the chassis and trying two-stage supercharging. In the Jersey races, Bob Gerard underlined his skill and ability, allied to the reliability of the car and its preparation, to see off much more modern machinery, winning from Chiron, de Graffenried, Bira and Parnell. Already, the regular Grand Prix drivers were in shock. Bira was defeated by Fangio at San Remo. The car was entered by Squadra Achille Varzi in memory of his mentor, but didn't come to Silverstone for the second British Grand Prix on the revised circuit. Both Parnell and Bira put on a show with Villaraci in trouble, but it was Bira who dominated until he had brake failure, crashing out of the race. At this stage, Bira was very much devoted to his racing. He still had the discipline of Prince Chula in the background. It was only in later years that Bira became a little wilder, enjoyed life a little more, and didn't take his racing quite so seriously. After his retirement, Bira stayed on to cheer teammate de Graffenried to victory ahead of Bob Gerard.
We had time to enjoy these races. You see, because when I won the British Grand Prix, I'll never forget, it took me a week to celebrate my victory. Today they take a couple of champagne and bye-bye, it's over. Well, that's life, you can't do anything about the modern things. And, well, that was the thing.
Throughout 1949, the French 4.5-litre Largo Talbots were developing more power and were quite a threat since they often completed the distance without a fuel stop. Louis Chiron remained devoted to Largo Talbot and won the French Grand Prix, but only after Bira had slowed to finish second, and Britain's Peter Whitehead lost all gears on his privately owned Ferrari and struggled home third. Talbot drivers Louis Rosier and Belgian band leader Johnny Claes, together with Philippe Antosselin, finished in the top 6 in a number of races. Rosier won the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa when the Ferraris fell back. Ferraris finished first and second in the Swiss race at Bern. Villaraci won the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort. Bira won his heat at Silverstone in the Daily Express Trophy. It was Farina who saved a Ferrari walkover there, separating Ascari and Villaraci. This race also saw Peter Walker finish in 5th place in the underdeveloped E-Type ERA, the first British car home. Farina beat Ascari at Lausanne, but the new Milano, a much modified 4CLT driven by Farina and Piero Taruffi, was a disaster against the heavily revised Ferrari at Monza. They were reduced to one car after Villaraci's retirement, but one was enough in a race that was marred by a display of temper by Farina when he couldn't compete with them.
It was hard in racing, yes. If you didn't leave him the road at a certain time, he went into you, bang, and he threw you off the road.
In contrast, Ascari could win from the front.
Very correct. But Ascari was a wonderful driver, and he was very, how you call that, very superstitious. And if I remember, he had a, a shirt. In these days, you have a shirt, and he'd had that shirt for the whole year of racing around. Never changed. He was so superstitious. And when he went down some stairs, he did 1, 2, 3, and he changed foot. But of course, Ascari was the driver, I think. Number one in my days. He had a very sad death, of course. He was trying a car, I think, in Monza, and I don't know what happened in how he went over a curve and the car went on him. He died.
1949 also saw the return of the Le Mans 24-hour endurance classic to the racing calendar. The Italian-American veteran, Luigi Chinetti, partnered by Lord Selsdon, took victory for Ferrari. The one-hour sports car support race at Silverstone saw Bira, Leslie Johnson and Peter Walker drive the new and exciting Jaguar XK120. This success saw Jaguar become a mighty force in sports car racing over the next decade. Johnson took victory after Bira's tyre burst. Motor racing has always been expensive, and following the Second World War, many people craved excitement and competition in their lives, particularly in Britain. A band of enthusiasts looked at the problem with reference to cost and ingenuity, and the 500cc racing movement was born. It grew and became the Half-Litre Club. This eventually became the British Racing and Sports Car Club, the BRSCC. There were a multitude of 500cc specials builders, all trying to get into business and become racing car manufacturers. Kieft and JBS were prominent names. Cooper was the most successful. The tiny cars were powered by modified British motorcycle engines from Triumph, Norton, JAP and other once famous names. The class brought new talent to the fore. Stirling Moss, Peter Collins, Stuart Lewis Evans, Jim Russell and Ivor Buab were just some of the drivers who became famous through this class. This racing challenged the whole concept of the wealthy enthusiast making his hobby into his business. Motor racing became a business and drivers became professionals. In 1950, Alfa had a major rethink over the 158. The power unit was once again the subject of more attention, and 350 brake horsepower was now available. At the first World Championship event at Silverstone, the Grand Prix d'Europe, Ferrari declined the challenge. Their modified Type 125 V12 was now producing almost 300 brake horsepower, but the chassis was still not handling properly, although a suggestion from Sommer had set Ferrari on a new course. Help was at hand with a slightly longer wheelbase in the chassis and assistance from Tony van der Velde on the engineering side, particularly in developing bearings. Ferrari cured his engine problems after he supplied a car to van der Velde for BRM to look at and practice with prior to their own car being ready. The cars and the drivers, old and new, were readying themselves for a fresh era, the first event in the World Championship.